Hello there! So I got to play the demo for AI Limit a little early, and I'm going to be sharing my experience with that. But also, I'm going to do a pretty thorough critique for the sake of developer feedback. Sense Games is a small Chinese studio from Chengdu. Often when these studios put out their demos, they are seeking what players think, and I'm a player that sometimes thinks, so I hope this finds some ears. I really believe that demos are a great thing, and they're a great practice for gaming in general. I want to encourage that, so I am doing my small part in positive reinforcement. At the end of the video, I also want to do a little bit of a channel update because it's certainly been a while. So if that interests you, stick around, or timestamps in the description. Anyways, let's talk AI Limit. How is the demo? The word I'm going to use is turbulent. I completed the sewer level available and the boss challenge, and once all was said and done, I feel kind of frustrated. And not because AI Limit has frustrating gameplay, but because there are certain sweet spots that AI Limit does so well, but it's often mixed in with a few antagonizing principles that don't gel very well, and there's a lack of polish that holds it back a little. Now, before we go any further, is the game good and is it worth your time? If you liked Code Vein, you will likely enjoy AI Limit. Being a Souls-like, and I hate that Souls-like is a genre tag, but that's a video essay for another time, but being a Souls-like is a bit of a double-edged sword. Everyone knows what to expect, and that's good, but also everyone knows what to expect, and that's bad. Like my brother in Christ, Dark Souls is the Arnold Schwarzenegger of video games. Do you really want to stand next to him and have your physique picked apart and destroyed? That said, lots of people like Souls games, they want more of them. It's like how many people just keep going to their favorite burger shop and make the same order week after week after week. They never get tired of it. So if you're expecting something that absolutely shatters the mold, then AI Limit is not it. But if you like that familiar feeling and you want to have another Souls run in an anime sci-fi setting, then yeah, take a seat. Jumping into the demo for the first time, we start off in the sewers of Heaven's Wall as Orisa. Orisa is a blader. What is a blader? Don't know. We know we aren't human because a really tall robot lady is going to tell us that we need to save human civilization. You are also not the only blader, though it's very apparent that this is a lot like the dark sign or being tarnished. You are immortal, you come back to life, you repair branches where you can rest and upgrade. To do these upgrades, collect crystals from fallen enemies. If you die, you lose some of your crystals, yada yada yada. You know it, I know it. AI Limit uses many Souls mechanics, and I'm not going to labor the point any further. Anyways, the thing that stood out to me after the intro and you get control of Orisa is that this game seems a little visually unfinished, and that's a bad start. It took a while for me to put my finger on it, and it's really a small thing, but it makes a world of difference, and we're going to see this over and over again in this video. While Orisa is a pretty cool looking character, it's definitely up my alley. I freaking love sci-fi anime AI, love those themes, and that really carries through here in the design, where Orisa herself is quite muted in color palette and somewhat neutral. That red scaly arm really stands out, and that speaks to me. But you start out standing in water and it's not acting like water. So if you pan the camera to the top, you can see that Orisa's footsteps make ripples, but these ripples are completely flat. Comparatively, later in the demo, there are instances where running in dirt kicks up little puffs of dust. You need to do the same thing with water, and the reason why it's so important is because it's the opening scene. It shows an attention to detail, but most importantly, it shows you that Orisa has weight and that she exists in the environment. This opening, as it is, makes it look like Orisa walks on top of the water surface, and once you set that in the player's mind, it's an uphill battle convincing them that this is a high quality game. That's certainly the feeling I got. The other aspect with the water that I got was, I feel that you need to darken the ground at the water's edge, so it looks like the water is seeping into the ground. The basic takeaway here is that I think the developers need to have another look at the environment in general, and just do the little things to make it look like the objects in the world look like they have an effect on each other in a way that makes sense, especially when it's the main character interacting with them in the opening scene. Next thing, I know it's a very small thing, but I think that a video game's intro needs to be immaculate to get a good public reception. I'll just say it how it is. Western audiences associate China with low quality because for many years, China has produced pretty much everything we use. We often forget that China makes our high quality iPhones, but we remember the cheap knockoff that we bought for half the price that broke in under a month. It is not fair, but it is true. Chinese developed games need perfect English. Whenever a Westerner sees English that doesn't flow well or has errors and they know it comes from China, bad game. cheap Souls knockoff. So technically I am happy to report that AI Limit's English text is pretty good, but it probably needs to be better to pass that bar. For example, let's look at the sync rate tutorial. You see how it has the same blurb at the top? To quote, sync rate is categorized into multiple levels which directly determine a blader's prowess in battle. So obviously you need to change determine to determines. But what is jarring is that the blurb remains at the top of each page, and then underneath that blurb, you have the description of what each sync level does. This doesn't flow well, we only need the blurb once. If I wanted to read it again, I would go back and read it. Removing the blurb from the top of page 3 onwards would make it easier to read. So anyways, let's talk about sync rate because that's the unique mechanic of AI Limit. It's pretty simple. You have mud energy and you can think of this as like a cross between mana and stamina. Stamina isn't a thing in AI Limit. If you want, you can just spam roll or dodge. It doesn't cost anything. Swinging your weapon doesn't cost anything either. But each weapon has a special move. You have a spell equipped. The railgun is the first one you get in the demo, and you also later get special abilities. There's 4 total. You get a parry, you get a shield, but later in the boss challenge, you get access to a dodge and a power-up ability. These all cost mud energy. Getting hit reduces mud energy. Scoring hits with your basic light and heavy attacks builds mud energy. Very simple, very intuitive. The basic flow is that if you use your basic attacks and dodge well, you will be able to use your special moves more often and they will be more effective. I think it's a pretty cool mechanic that streamlines the interface and rewards players for doing the basics well. But, and this is important, if your sync rate drops to 0%, Orisa is stunned and can't move. I don't think many people will like this. Most times this happens because you were hit and you have just taken damage, so you take damage and then you are at the mercy of the game's AI as to whether they are going to just keep hitting you. But I think taking damage and dying is punishment enough. It's also important to remember that bosses tend to kill you in 3 to 4 hits in this demo, so getting hit twice because you lost your sync rate once is pretty severe. In my opinion, I think they need to think of some other side effect. Maybe you can't swing your weapon for a couple of seconds. I don't know, I just think that getting damaged, then getting stun locked, then getting hit again is an unfun thing. Also, I know that you can change the control scheme and you can bind your buttons to whatever you want. I was using a PlayStation controller, but it is a sin that you need to hold X to sprint by default. I think AI Limit needs to swap the jump and the sprint button, click the L3 to initiate the sprint, and then X to jump. Also, the jump seems visually unimpressive when you consider Orisa's abilities. Like, I know that this is a traditional Dark Souls jump mechanic where you can only jump in a horizontal arc and it has to be from a sprint, but I think you should be able to jump further than you can dodge, if that makes sense. As it is now, it's a bit confusing because it looks like she's trying really hard and her efforts are pathetic. Anyways, moving on, the early parts of the sewers are pretty inconsequential. The enemies are very easy and mostly distracted. I think the void or mud monsters, I'm going to call them mud monsters, are okay, but they do seem a little too generic and familiar. Like later in the demo, you go into this room where there's these 2 humans. One has a knife and the other guy, he has a flamethrower. That's badass. I kind of wish that you saw human enemies first, because ironically they're more interesting. Like, when was the last time you saw a human enemy in a Souls game that isn't zombified or wearing some ornate helm that covers their entire face? There's also this big fella sitting here. I think this is an attempt to do something like the Asylum Demon in Dark Souls. It kills you in a couple of hits, so you die once and then it's very clear that you're supposed to come back later, or engage masochist mode and figure it out. I think it doesn't work very well here though, and I'm going to explain the key differences. The first was that in Dark Souls you had to pass the Asylum Demon to progress. This guy is completely optional. The lesson was that it was really difficult. You die and then you are very aware that you are not ready for the dangers of this world and you need to think of another way to approach the situation. So naturally people try to run past it and that works. Later of course you get a better weapon and you learn about plunge attacks, and then you are set up to drop down on the demon and you have the feeling of things clicking. It sets the expectation of how to approach obstacles for the entire game. This guy in AI Limit doesn't do that. So I'm not sure what it does other than to be the first reminder of, hey, I know everything up to this point has been trivial, but that's over for you. Sync. So we travel a little further and we come across our first boss, or mini boss, the sewer cleaner. This becomes a new standard enemy and we're going to get the railgun from it. I hate these robots. I think everyone is going to hate these robots and I'm going to explain why. Remember how I said that the void monsters are generic? Well, they look generic, but fighting them makes sense and their movements make sense. I think if you're making a game where you want the player to react to what the enemy is doing, then the movements and telegraphs need to be readable. As soon as you make those movements inhuman and robotic, you lose that readability, and the main reason why this happens is a lack of attention to detail. Look at any machine in real life and you will know that machines don't just move erratically. Often you can hear the spinning of motors, an electrical buzz, some sort of gas pressure release. Creating better sound cues for these robotic enemies' movements will go a long way to making their movements seem more authentic. For example, the slide attack would make more sense if there were little rockets at its feet that pushed it forwards, and then you can use the sound of the rockets firing up just before the action takes place to make sense of the fact that the robot is just skidding towards you with both feet on the ground. Small aside, I think the railgun firing effect needs a little more detail. My first thought was that it? When it should be, that's awesome, I want one of those. Okay, so I've touched on a lot of criticisms and we're not even at the first branch or the first resting side. If there's so much wrong with AI Limit, why did I even bother? Well, we get to our first branch and that's where we meet Asteria, the branch weaver. Love the aesthetic of this character, basically the Firekeeper in most Souls games, but I am all about those robot stealth legs. Remember what I said about English and flow? To quote, an ancient underground drainage tunnel deep underground in the south region of Heavenswell. Less is more. An ancient drainage tunnel deep underground in the south region of Heavenswell. No need to say underground twice. And yeah, this is really small stuff, but I'm giving this critique for the developer's sake if by some 0.05% chance they actually ever see this. Because it's tough, because they're trying to make a game to sell it to English speakers, and the people that they hired to write and check the English, they've let them down and no one's going to tell them. The Steam reviews will just say that the story is corny or that it is low quality, and that's the only level of detail they're going to get from the public. Also, Arissa does speak in the beginning and she speaks again here.
It's a pleasure to know that you've arrived safely. What's this place?
Anyways, point is, I think Asteria is cool, and for the most part, I think it sets up the story to be fairly interesting. She lets you pick your first real weapon. Choices are sword, dual blade, and long sword. I picked the dual blade. This is kind of a mistake because you get the dual blades as a pickup within the next 20 minutes, but that could be exclusive to the demo. Anyways, the point is that the combat animations for these weapons are of a higher detail than the tutorial sword. Specifically, when you do your light attack out of a sprint. There's no animation for this with the tutorial sword, but there is for the dual blade, and you'll find later that these three weapon types have the same base animations for most weapons that you'll get. Another thing, this is where you start seeing the humans that I was talking about before. Some of them will attack you, others are just NPCs, but I remember having a sense of relief because I was worried that most of the normal enemies are going to be variations of the mud monsters. I mean, they're still here and they are stronger, they're more aware, some of them hide around corners. This is a Souls special alongside rolling through barrels, but the point is that it gave me hope that perhaps it's not just the mud monsters in red tint and later the mud monsters in blue tint. Because that would kill the game instantly for me, because let's be real, in a Souls-like, the design and the variety of enemies is actually more important than the main character. Like, yeah, you want the main character to be cool, but what are you doing half of the time? You see an enemy with a cool sword, it does this crazy move where it leaps into the air and it does this massive attack. Now you want to kill that enemy and take the cool sword because you want to be able to use the cool sword. That boss with the awesome armor? Mine. That great shield that's bigger than my body? Mine. Is part of the cycle. You take the power of those that oppose you to make the world better, only to find that you are no less helplessly corrupt than the beings that you sought to defeat, and now you look the same. That's the soul cycle of human nature and its futility. AI Limit is a little different because you are a named character, but the underlying principle still applies. The first thing I thought when I saw the guy with the flamethrower was, can I use the flamethrower? I want to use the flamethrower. Let me use the flamethrower, please. And so you can see that there isn't really space for this appeal with the mud monsters, because the quality of the gameplay instantly lifts once you start getting real weapons, real enemy variety. The colossal robot with the laser eye guarding the tunnel, actually awesome. Instantly thought of the Helldrake in Dark Souls in a good way, and that was cool. I mentioned the parry before, or counterfield in AI Limit. This is a game changer. Like, it instantly improves combat a lot. In my opinion, I think you should be able to use the parry from the beginning of the game. Don't make veteran Souls players suffer every time they start the game. It's been decades, we all know how parries work. Which leads to the question, how good is the parry and riposte in this game? Yeah, it's pretty fucking good. It reminds me a lot of the Parry in Dark Souls, the original and best. It's reliable, but not so reliable that it feels cheap. It's satisfying and visceral, the sound cues are really great. Minor complaint, when you shove your arm through a mud monster, I think the mud that splashes out would make more sense if it had a bit of a darker tone. It looks a little too similar to the actual surface of the monsters themselves. That's just my opinion. My experience, the mud monsters were fairly easy to reliably parry unless it was a lunge attack. That's sort of the standard. But the robots and the bosses that have those kind of stilted animations feel almost impossible to react to from both sides. As I said before, I think you need better audio cues. Dodging and rolling, same button, same iframes, does what it says on the tin. Before you get the parry, this is your only defensive option, but the enemies are so pathetic in the tutorial that you never really learn it. I think the best place to get a feel for it is in the boss challenge, because it kind of shows you through trial and error exactly what you can and can't get away with. Anyways, we go past the giant robot. Our next ability that we get is a shield. So parry is an ability and the shield is an ability, and you have to swap between them. The shield does block all damage, but it drains your mud energy while you have it up, and you can also choose to blow it up once you've taken a beating. Small detail I think it's worth mentioning. When you're holding up the shield and you take a hit, Orisa gets pushed back. It would really sell the weight of what's happening if your feet kicked up the surface, whether that be dust, water, mud, whatever. Without it, it just looks a little unfinished because you're skating across the ground like it's a smooth surface. But yeah, I'm not really a shield guy. I did end up trying it out in the boss fight at the end of the demo during the second phase, but I'm not really about that life. Okay, so I'm editing this and I'm realizing why I don't like the shield. The first reason is the way that you use your special abilities, or frame abilities. You hold L1 and then you press X, square, triangle, or circle to select the ability you want to use, and then you press L2 to activate the selected ability. I don't think that the parry should be a frame ability. I think it's far too impactful for an ability to not be part of Orisa's base kit, especially because AI Limit doesn't have a combo system. Like, you're not weaving light and heavy attacks like Stellar Blade, so it really needs the counter field to simply have an engaging combat loop. I think L2 should always do counter field. Everyone's going to default to it anyways, just to make general gameplay enjoyable, and the value proposition is just much higher than the other abilities. So I think that if you remove counterfield from the frame ability menu and then you have it mapped to L2, you can then press L1 and square, and I want Orisa to pull out the shield the moment I press that combination. I don't want to first select an ability and then use it in an action game. I want to be able to activate these abilities in as few moves as possible so I can react to things as they happen. And if I'm not supposed to do that, then I don't want to have the option at all. I'll just pick the best one and I'll never try the other ones. It may as well be like the spells. Now, my second problem with the shield is that the fantasy isn't there for me. In my opinion, there are two kinds of shield users: people that aren't comfortable with the game's mechanics yet, and that one guy that wants to be built like a fortress. Like, if you don't feel like a Spartan hoplite at the hot gates, you are just a guy sitting on the couch holding a button. Look at how small this shield is. Look at your stance. This isn't fucking Sailor Moon, is it? I think a lot of games get this wrong. The animations for how you brace behind the shield and how you move, they are even more important than the parry and riposte, because what you're doing is fundamentally kind of boring, so you have to make up for it somewhere. And I think the developers need to go back on this one, look at the parry and riposte animations, and then think to themselves, okay, how do we make using the shield ability match this level of energy? That's what I really think. Now, what I think is really cool is that after the shield, we come across our first fallen blader. I love this fight. I love this setup. The way she moves is absolutely deranged. It's obvious that she has lost the plot, but look how smooth the movements are. It's both unsettling because it's foreign, but also easy to read because she's always leaning into her movements. But aside from the mechanics and readability, I think these moves are pretty cool. And I'm thinking, am I going to be able to do some of these moves later? I think this is a great sequence. We're then going to continue for a while before we get to the boss of the demo. Badass setting, great mood, foreboding, and then you see him. Lore the Lost Lancer, the last of the Bionicles. Something's not quite right with Lore. It took me a while to put my finger on it, but you know what it is? In my opinion, it's the same problem as the very beginning of the demo. Here, look at where you are. Now look at him. All around the room, there is mud, dead bodies, broken machinery, and it looks like it's been that way for a very long time. This boss is apparently the thing that did all of this destruction and lost his mind. Look at his feet. they're clean. You would expect them to be caked in mud. Look at the lance. Yes, there's blood on the tip, but dried blood isn't red. It's like that reddy brown, almost black if it's thick enough. And what about the armor? Because if you kill a lot of people and you're in the mud, how is it that none of this is on the armor? Finally, I think the cyan energy tubes are a bit much. So I took a screenshot and I just doodled on top of it for 20 minutes or so to show you what I mean. Here's the original. And here is my edit with a bunch of muck and grime, and I just added a few extra spikes on the shoulder pads because I wasn't really happy with how round he looked. To me, this looks more in line with the setting and the feeling of the game as it is presented to me as far as I've played it. But hey, this is all subjective, I could be totally wrong. Let me know which one you prefer in the comments below. As for the boss fight itself, it's a pretty decent fight. It's what you would expect from many Souls-likes. I couldn't quite shake the feeling that I didn't enjoy it as much as fighting the Blader. There's something about the way he moves that just feels a little clunky. So I went back to watch the fight with Artorias in Dark Souls, Ornstein, and then I had a look at Godric in Elden Ring. And then I thought, well, AI Limit is supposed to be more of an action Souls-like, so I had a look at some of my Stellar Blade footage. It kind of confirmed what I suspected but wasn't willing to say without checking, but the simple answer is that Lord the Lost Lancer swings faster than the telegraph implies. And look, it's not a huge problem. There's certain moves that are dead simple to parry, especially the jump attack. I know it sounds counterintuitive, but when you compare the two, in Souls games generally, big weapons that do big damage also swing slower. The major caveat to that is when there is some sort of really long hang time or power-up move that comes beforehand. Now, comparatively, Stellar Blade bosses do move faster, but your ability to parry is far more lenient and matches the speed at which the bosses move. It's just easier to parry multiple attacks in succession in that game. Anyways, in Phase 2, Lord goes feral. That killed me a few times. It was pretty tough and I did kind of enjoy it, but I'm a little down on this fight because I just had more fun fighting against the Blader, and at this point the demo is just about over, but now we get to play the boss challenge. The Hunter of Bladers. I would change her name to the Huntress. Just less is more. Anyways, this Huntress, she kicked my ass so many times. And I just kept going back and saying, please miss, can I have some more? This kind of goes back to what I said about the Blader. I mean, this is way harder than Lord the Lost Lancer. The animations are so smooth and readable. It's just a joy to see it. And the best part about it is that this is like an epic anime duel. There's a dance and a rhythm to it. And the other part of it is that you have access to a lot of weapons and abilities. I tried a few of them, but I really like the lightning dash because it makes me feel like we're rivals on equal footing. I just think it looks cool to kind of choreograph this elaborate, unscripted fight scene. This fight alone is the reason that I am pretty excited for AI Limit, and it's also why I've been so in depth with my feedback. It's also why I'm a bit torn, because I feel like AI Limit does humanoid duels really, really well, but it doesn't do some of the fundamental Souls things very well. So let me sum it up. I think the environment, and especially attention to how objects affect other objects within the game environment, needs another pass, in my opinion. It's a small thing, but it will have a huge impact on how people perceive what is mechanically a very solid game. The English needs to be looked at, and some of the dialogue needs another look. Be careful of repeating unimportant information. Again, small thing, huge impact. I feel like the mod monsters should also be dirtier, sort of the same critique I had for lore. They're too clean. Like, I know it's not necessarily true, but the first word that comes to mind when I look at them is asset store. The robot enemies need a lot of work with their telegraphs, how they move in the environment, the sounds they make. I think they're really cool to look at, but fighting them is not fun at all. Not a fan of the zero sync rate stunning you. I think Lord the Lost Lancer's animations could use looking at. In my mind, I think of many Souls boss fights falling into one of three categories: a lumbering Hulk, a rival duel, or a puzzle. Lore looks like a Hulk, but kind of fights like a duel. The movements in relation to the size of the weapon and the telegraphs aren't quite right though. And when you compare them to enemies like the Blader and the Huntress, they're from the same game, but I know which one is right and which one isn't, and Lore is the one that isn't right. Now, usually it's like, okay, that's one boss, but it's the first boss, so it really, really matters. If I played the demo and Lore was the last boss fight, then maybe I wouldn't be interested in AI Limit, but the Huntress is there to save the demo, and that's really what's got my attention. I'm now interested, and I think the developers might already be aware of this, but they might not be ready to admit it yet. Like, in my mind, I wouldn't go to the extra effort of putting in the Huntress in a boss challenge challenge if I knew that Lord the Lost Lancer was a really awesome fight. So I see this addition as a kind of admission that you know it's not your best work. Anyways, that's a lot of critique. What was awesome? The UI for AI Limit is really good. I know I never mention it, but that's what good UIs do. They become invisible when you're actually enjoying the game. The gameplay is solid. It certainly doesn't reinvent the wheel, but once you get your parry and your first weapon, it just feels familiar and good. And later on, you will get a bunch of cool spells that will let you play your way, but we'll have to see what the full scope and depth of that looks like when the game releases. There were definitely moments where I was totally sold on the atmosphere. Like the scene just before Laura arrives, menacing. The colossal robot, Asteria's legs, random guy with a flamethrower. Like, I'm more impressed that they had the restraint to only put one guy with a flamethrower than I am that there is a guy with the flamethrower. And I think that's great. I'm probably going to go to bed tonight thinking about that. The Huntress was amazing. Like, you know you're onto something good when you fight a boss and you wish that they were a playable character. And I felt that immediately. So look, I think the majority of this video works as a critique for the developers, but I think this is really helpful for people that are looking to play the game as well. If any of this sounds awesome to you, I do encourage you to try the demo out for yourself. It'll be on Steam and the PlayStation Store. And this is a small development team. So I think if you enjoy the game and you had a lot of fun, the best way you can help them is to wishlist their game. That makes such a huge difference for them, and it's a really small thing. Me personally, I am very optimistic that given some time, AI Limit will be a solid game, and I am looking forward to seeing what they come up with. More Huntress and flamethrowers, please. Alright, that just about wraps everything up, except for the channel update. So here it goes. I'm a pretty shit YouTuber. I said I was going to do a bunch of reviews, I didn't do them. I said I was going to do a bunch of series, I didn't do them. So for everyone that stuck around, thanks, you're the real ones. YouTube is really a hobby for me, and my aim is to be authentic. That being said, I feel like I sometimes make the mistake of saying that I will do a bunch of things because I think they're cool ideas at the time, but if my heart's not in it, or I've already said everything I wanted to say, it's probably not going to happen. Recently, I've been really hard at work on my own card game and video game, Project BB. I don't have anything to share right at this moment other than that we have our heads down and we're working hard on it. I'm currently working on the art for the main characters. Pretty happy with how it's going so far, and yeah, the two things don't really work well together, you know, full-time job, married, and YouTube, or full-time job, married, and game development. So that's why you aren't seeing a lot of content from me, and it's likely to continue for a while, but the one thing that I can guarantee is that I love gaming so much. I will keep making videos about video games, blah blah blah. You're washed up, Liv! Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.